They said love makes people do crazy things. But Ruth Brown Snyder took that to a deadly extreme. A woman who looked like any other housewife of 1920s New York, hiding secrets darker than the shadows of the Jazz Age. Tonight we uncover how passion turned into murder, and how her name became immortalized in the flash of a camera. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because this is one tale you won't want to forget. They say every quiet neighborhood hides its share of secrets, but none could have guessed what lay behind the white picket fences of Queens Village, New York, in the 1920s. The air smelled of lilacs and gasoline, the streets filled with the hum of Model Ts and the soft chatter of homemakers exchanging gossip over clotheslines. It was a time when image mattered more than truth, and Ruth Brown Snyder understood that better than anyone. She wasn't born into glamour or wealth. Ruth was an ordinary girl, raised in a world where women were expected to smile, serve dinner at 6, and never complain. She married Albert Snyder, a respectable art editor for a magazine. He was older, serious and emotionally distant, a man who loved his late fiancée more than his living wife. He even kept a portrait of her in their home, like a ghost that haunted Ruth's marriage every single day. To neighbors, they were the picture of domestic success. To Ruth, it was a cold prison with lace curtains. Albert liked routine, black coffee, sharp creases, and silence at breakfast. Ruth liked attention, laughter, color, and the thrill of being wanted. She often stood by the window, watching cars go by, wondering what it would feel like to live a life that burned with excitement instead of duty. When she entertained guests, her smile was perfect, but her eyes gave her away, restless, searching, and just a little too alive. Ruth's discontent simmered quietly, like a pot left on low heat. She wasn't the kind to shout or throw plates. No, she preferred subtlety. A well-placed compliment here, a sympathetic ear there. People liked her. She made them feel important. That charm would soon become her most dangerous weapon. By 1925, the world around her was changing fast. Jazz filled the speakeasies, flappers danced without shame, and women were beginning to taste independence. But Ruth wasn't one to find freedom through social movements or self-reflection. She found hers through infatuation. When she met Judd Gray, a corset salesman with a gentle manner and a weakness for drama, the match struck instantly. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before Judd, there was the illusion. Ruth's carefully curated image of domestic perfection. She kept her house spotless, her daughter Lorraine well-dressed, and her husband's dinner warm even when her heart wasn't. She smiled for the neighbors, baked for the church, and wore her pearls just so. It wasn't love holding her family together. It was performance. Inside, she was slipping. Nights were long, filled with quiet resentment and the hum of a man's snoring she'd grown to despise. Albert's obsession with his deceased lover had become unbearable. He compared Ruth to her, unfavorably, and spoke of her ghost as though she were still alive. Each word was a knife. And Ruth, who'd once dreamed of a passionate life, found herself trapped with a man who saw her as a replacement at best, an inconvenience at worst. One evening, as the city lights flickered through the window, Ruth made a decision. If life was a performance, then she'd start directing it. No more waiting for affection, no more settling for scraps of attention. She'd take what she wanted, even if it meant breaking every rule. Her transformation was quiet but deliberate. She began dressing differently, more vibrant colors, a touch more rouge, a hint of something forbidden. She joined social clubs, attended events, and let herself be noticed. And when someone finally noticed her, really noticed her, she didn't turn away. But we'll save that moment for later. For now, picture Ruth at her vanity mirror, brushing her hair by lamplight. The reflection staring back isn't the same woman who once believed in vows and virtue. It's someone colder, someone calculating, someone learning to use beauty as currency. To the outside world, nothing had changed. The Snyders still appeared at church on Sundays. Albert still went to work, punctual as a clock. Lorraine still played in the yard. But something intangible had shifted. A tension hung in the air, invisible yet sharp. the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder without knowing why. Ruth's smiles grew softer, her tone gentler, but her thoughts grew darker. She was rehearsing for a role she hadn't yet named, but one that would soon make her infamous. When Ruth looked at Albert now, she didn't see a husband. She saw an obstacle, a man standing between her and everything she believed she deserved. And in her mind, the script began to form, a plan for freedom, for passion, for a second chance at life, one that didn't involve Albert Snyder breathing in it. There were moments, fleeting, almost human moments, when Ruth's guilt peeked through, like when she watched her daughter sleep, the innocence softening her heart for just a second. But then she'd remember the way Albert spoke to her, the way he dismissed her, and her resolve would return, stronger each time. She wasn't just planning a betrayal. She was convincing herself it was justified. It's easy from the outside to call her a monster, but Ruth didn't see it that way. In her mind, she was rewriting her story, escaping a life that had never been truly hers. She wasn't plotting murder, she was chasing liberation. That's the thing about people like Ruth Brown Snyder. They always believe the ending will make sense of the madness. By the winter of 1925, her internal war had gone quiet. She smiled. Through it all, dinners, holidays, polite laughter with Albert's colleagues. But her eyes told another story, one that no one dared to read. Behind every glance and gesture was a storm waiting for the right moment to break. When Judd Gray finally entered her life, he wasn't a coincidence. He was inevitability. You the Yui kind of man Ruth had been summoning in her thoughts for years. He offered tenderness where Albert gave indifference, attention where she'd found neglect. He told her she was beautiful, and she believed him. That belief, that desperate need to feel seen, would soon pull both of them into a web that neither could escape. But that's for the next chapter, when love turns into conspiracy, and the gentle touch of romance becomes the hand that holds a pillow over a man's face. For now, remember this. Every tragedy starts with a simple feeling: dissatisfaction. And in the case of Ruth Brown Snyder, that feeling was about to spark one of the most scandalous crimes of the century. It began like most forbidden things do, quietly, innocently, almost by accident. A chance meeting, a polite smile, a shared glance that lingered just a second too long. That's how Ruth Brown Snyder met Judd Gray, the man who would ignite a fire she could never put out. Judd wasn't the kind of man who commanded attention when he walked into a room. He was modest, almost shy, with a nervous energy that made him seem harmless. A corset salesman by trade, Judd was used to flattery and small talk. But when Ruth first stepped into his orbit, something electric sparked between them, an unspoken recognition of mutual loneliness. Their first real conversation happened over tea, the kind of chat that seems innocent until you replay it later and realize every word was a step closer to disaster. Ruth, dressed in soft pastels, leaned in with that effortless charm she'd perfected over years of pretending to be the perfect wife. Judd, fumbling with his words, tried to maintain his composure, but her gaze disarmed him completely. She laughed at his jokes, touched his arm lightly, and just like that, she had him. To Ruth, Judd wasn't just a man. He was validation, proof that she could still inspire desire, that she wasn't fading into the wallpaper of her own home. To Judd, Ruth was everything he'd ever fantasized about but never dared pursue: mature, bold, and intoxicatingly dangerous. Together, they created a bubble of delusion, a world where they could be their truest, most reckless selves. Soon letters began to pass between them, passionate, desperate confessions of love that dripped with longing. In those letters, Ruth poured out her resentment for Albert and painted herself as a victim trapped in a loveless cage. Judd, eager to play her savior, promised to rescue her, though he had no idea what that would come to mean. Their affair became a secret rhythm: meetings in hotels, whispers on street corners, coded messages left in flower arrangements. The thrill was half the pleasure. The more Ruth tasted of this forbidden world, the less she could stomach her life at home. Albert's predictable routines now felt suffocating, his mere presence intolerable. The same man she once served dinner to now represented everything she despised: restraint, duty, boredom. She'd come alive with Judd. With Albert, she was decaying. Ruth's manipulation was subtle at first. She spoke to Judd about her misery, about how trapped she felt, how her husband didn't love her, how even her child seemed to remind her of the life she'd never wanted. Judd, emotional and impressionable, absorbed every word. He started to believe that helping Ruth meant saving her. And when she began hinting that the only way they could ever truly be together was if Albert were gone, Judd didn't walk away. He hesitated, but he didn't walk away. Ruth, ever the actress, played both roles perfectly. To Albert, she remained dutiful, kind, attentive. To Judd, she was a damsel in distress, desperate for liberation. What she really was, though, was a woman with a plan, one that was becoming clearer with each passing day. Their affair deepened. The thrill of secrecy evolved into obsession. They met in hotel rooms with drawn curtains where time seemed to stop. Ruth would speak of a future where they could live freely, where her daughter would have a loving stepfather, where the past would simply vanish. Judd, lost in fantasy, believed her. He wasn't a criminal by nature, just a man under the spell of a woman who could make sin sound like salvation. But Ruth was careful. She didn't rush him. Instead, she planted ideas like seeds, watering them with words that sounded innocent enough. He'll never let me go. He'd rather see me dead than happy. If only there were a way out. Each sentence was a thread, weaving Judd tighter into her web. By late 1926, the tone of their meetings had changed. Passion gave way to plotting. Ruth began mentioning details: Albert's life insurance policy, his habits, the way he locked the doors at night. She spoke of opportunity and timing, testing Judd's limits with every word. He flinched, protested, but she always soothed him, reminding him that it was all for love. "Don't you want to be with me forever?" she'd whisper, her hand tracing circles on his wrist. "Then we have no choice. Love can make fools of men." And Judd Gray, once a mild-mannered corset salesman, was about to become a killer in love's disguise. Ruth's mind worked like a chessboard, every move calculated, every emotion rehearsed. She began creating an alibi, planting stories among neighbors about Albert's temper, his supposed paranoia, even his health. She needed people to believe the right version of events when the time came. Her charm made it easy. People believed Ruth. She had that gift. As winter deepened, their relationship became more reckless. They started to believe their own fantasy, that they could commit the perfect crime and vanish into a happily ever after. Ruth convinced Judd that Albert deserved it, that his death would set them both free. She told him that God would understand, that love justified anything. And Judd, trembling with fear and devotion, began to agree. But even as they plotted, a shadow of guilt lingered. Judd was no murderer, not yet. He drank to quiet his nerves, prayed for a sign that would stop him. But Ruth, relentless and persuasive, always pulled him back in. She'd call him her angel, her only hope. And when he tried to back out, she wept, manipulating his conscience like a violin. Their affair, once a secret pleasure, had become a noose tightening around them both. Every stolen kiss now carried the weight of a corpse not yet buried. Every touch was a reminder of what they were about to do. The final plan came together like a dark symphony. Ruth told Judd exactly how it would happen. The night, the tools, the story they'd tell afterward. It would look like a burglary gone wrong. They'd stage the scene, make it convincing. Then, once it was done, they'd collect the insurance money and run away together. It was madness, and Judd, blinded by devotion, agreed. But even in her most fevered moments, Ruth didn't see Judd as an equal. To her, he was a means to an end, a willing hand to execute the act she couldn't fully stomach herself. She controlled him with tenderness and terror, weaving him deeper into guilt until he couldn't escape. In the quiet hours before dawn, Ruth would lie awake, imagining life without Albert. She saw herself draped in furs, smiling beside Judd in a sunlit cafe, free at last. She never pictured blood. She never pictured the chaos that would follow. In her mind, it was a clean break, a simple erasure. But history has a way of punishing hubris. And Ruth's world, so carefully constructed from lies and longing, was about to come crashing down in the most spectacular fashion. The night they chose would become one of the most infamous in American true crime, a scene of passion, violence, and betrayal that would shock the nation and immortalize Ruth Brown Snyder as the face of Femme Fatale infamy. For now, we leave her standing at the edge of that decision, one foot in desire, the other in damnation. Her hand on the telephone whispering to Judd, "Tomorrow night, darling. Tomorrow it all ends." The night of March 20th, 1927, was unnervingly still in Queens Village. A light drizzle slicked the streets, the kind of night that swallowed sound and turned every shadow into a secret. Inside the Snyder household, the lamps were dimmed, the curtains drawn. To any passerby, it was an ordinary evening in a quiet neighborhood. But behind that calm exterior, the stage had been set for murder. Ruth Brown Snyder had planned every detail, the timing, the tools, even the story they'd tell the police. To her, this wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Judd Gray, trembling with anxiety, had arrived hours earlier, sneaking in through the side door like a ghost. He was dressed in dark clothes, his hat pulled low, a handkerchief tied around his mouth to calm his shaking jaw. He wasn't a killer, not by nature, but by this point, nature didn't matter. Ruth's words echoed in his mind. "We'll be free, Judd. Just this one night, and we'll be free." Albert Snyder slept soundly upstairs, unaware that death was moving closer with every creaking floorboard. He was a man who trusted order and structure, and perhaps that's what blinded him, the belief that life, like his art layouts, always stayed inside the lines. Tonight, Ruth and Judd were about to destroy those lines forever. The murder itself was not elegant or swift. It was brutal, messy, desperate, a crime of passion disguised as calculation. Ruth had told Judd to use a sash weight, something heavy enough to make it quick. But when the moment came, Judd froze. The sight of the sleeping man, the quiet rise and fall of his chest, paralyzed him. Ruth, furious and impatient, urged him on. And when Judd hesitated again, she acted. A thud echoed through the house, the first blow, then another. Albert stirred, confused, half awake, struggling to comprehend what was happening. He fought back, clawing at the darkness, but it was too late. Between the two of them, Ruth and Judd overpowered him. The sash weight, a length of picture wire, a pillow, all instruments of panic and fury. When it was finally over, the room smelled of iron and fear. The walls seemed to hold their breath. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Judd's hands shook violently. He couldn't look at what they'd done. Ruth, on the other hand, was eerily composed. Her dress was splattered, her face pale but calm. "It's done," she whispered. "Now help me fix the rest." The rest was the staging, the false story they'd prepared. Ruth wanted it to look like a burglary gone wrong. They overturned furniture, broke a window, scattered papers, and ransacked drawers. Judd, still trembling, followed her instructions like a puppet. They took a few small items to make it look convincing, including Albert's watch and a few bonds. But despite the chaos they created, something about the scene felt off, too deliberate, too theatrical. They placed a chloroform-soaked rag near the bed, hoping it would suggest intruders. Then Ruth bound herself loosely with curtain cords and gagged her own mouth, pretending she had been attacked and left alive. It was all part of her script. She wanted to be the grieving widow, the helpless survivor. In her mind, she would be both victim and victor. When everything was in place, Judd slipped out through the same side door, heart pounding, the taste of guilt thick on his tongue. He walked into the fog, a man forever changed. Ruth waited until she thought enough time had passed, then began her performance. Her voice cut through the night, a scream rehearsed to perfection. Neighbors awoke, lights flickered on, and soon the police were rushing to her door. "Help! Someone's killed my husband!" she cried, her wrists still tied, her face painted with terror. To the untrained eye, it was believable. To the detectives, something didn't sit right. At first glance, the crime scene seemed consistent with a robbery. But as investigators looked closer, inconsistencies began to surface. The bindings around Ruth's wrists were suspiciously loose. The ransacking appeared staged, with valuables left untouched. The broken window, the supposed point of entry, had glass scattered outside the frame, not inside. It was an amateur's attempt at deception, and the police could smell it. Ruth's story shifted under questioning. She said she'd been knocked unconscious, then she claimed she'd woken to find her husband already dead. Her tears came on cue, but her timing was too precise, her grief too polished. Seasoned detectives knew the difference between shock and theater, and then came the discovery, the one mistake that unraveled it all. In the confusion of the night, Judd Gray had left behind a monogrammed piece of evidence, a small sash weight tag bearing the initials of his hotel. It didn't take long for the police to trace it back to him. When questioned, Judd cracked almost immediately. He confessed everything: the affair, the plot, the murder. He even described the moments of hesitation, the panic, the way Ruth had urged him to finish what they'd started. Ruth, of course, denied it all. She painted herself as the innocent party, the victim of Judd's manipulation. "He was obsessed with me," she told the police, her voice trembling. "He must have done it out of jealousy." But the evidence spoke louder than her tears. Her fingerprints were everywhere, her lies too tangled to hold. The love letters they'd exchanged, passionate and incriminating, sealed her fate. The press descended on Queens Village like vultures. The murder of Albert Snyder became a national sensation, a perfect storm of sex, betrayal, and violence. Headlines screamed her name across the country. "Blonde widow accused of slaying husband. Corset salesman and housewife in murder pact." The story had everything a Roaring Twenties audience craved: scandal, lust, and the collapse of moral facade. Ruth wasn't just a suspect anymore. She was a celebrity of sin. Reporters described her with a mix of fascination and disgust. A woman too beautiful to hang, too wicked to forgive. Photographers fought to capture her expressions in court, each snapshot feeding the public's hunger for spectacle. Ruth basked in it, even as the walls closed in. She smiled for the cameras, adjusted her hat, and seemed almost flattered by the attention. Judd, on the other hand, looked hollow, a man consumed by regret. Behind the polished marble of the courthouse, the truth was painfully clear. The so-called perfect crime had been anything but. Ruth's arrogance and Judd's fear had left a trail of evidence that couldn't be ignored. They had both underestimated the world, the detectives, the journalists, and even each other. When the verdict came down, it was swift and merciless: guilty. Both were sentenced to die in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. The lovers who once whispered promises of forever now faced eternity apart, separated by walls, wires, and the slow march of justice. As Ruth sat in her cell, the mask finally slipped. The vanity, the charm, the calculated smiles, all stripped away. What remained was a woman who had played too many roles and lost herself in every one of them. Outside, the nation waited for her final act, hungry for one more moment of spectacle. But that would come later, in a flash of light, a photograph, and a single moment frozen in time that would make her immortal. For now, the curtain falls on the murder itself. A love story turned horror, a life of comfort destroyed by desire, and a crime that would forever change how America viewed the dark heart of the ordinary housewife. The courtroom smelled of ink and perfume, a mix of reporters' notepads and the faint powder Ruth Brown Snyder wore like armor. The trial of the century had begun, and the world couldn't look away. Flashbulbs burst like lightning every time she entered, her expression calm, her posture immaculate, her eyes distant but unyielding. If she was going to fall, she was determined to do it with style. Across the room sat Judd Gray, the man who once whispered love into her ear, now staring down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. Between them was the electric tension of two people who'd once shared everything, now united only by their mutual destruction. He looked smaller than he had before, frail and remorseful. She, by contrast, seemed defiant, the picture of a woman betrayed. The prosecution wasted no time painting their picture: a cold, manipulative wife who seduced a weak man into murder. They laid out the evidence like a script Ruth herself had written. The love letters, filled with phrases like, "Our freedom will come soon," were read aloud for the jury, each word slicing through the illusion she'd tried so hard to maintain. Ruth sat there chin high, her eyes narrowing only slightly when the letters were mentioned. But beneath the calm, her stomach churned. Judd's testimony was the final betrayal. Under oath, he told everything: how they met, how the affair grew, how she had whispered the plan into his mind piece by piece. He spoke in a trembling voice, but the words were clear. Ruth had been the architect, the mastermind, the one who had pushed him past the point of no return. Every detail made her seem colder, more dangerous. The woman who once promised him love now sat silently as he sealed both their fates. When it was Ruth's turn to testify, she turned the tables as best she could. She played her final role, the misunderstood widow, seduced and manipulated by a conniving man. Her voice trembled at just the right moments. Her eyes glistened with practiced tears. "He took advantage of my loneliness," she said softly. "He wanted my husband's death, not me." It was a performance that might have worked on stage, but not in front of a jury that had already seen through her curtain of deceit. Reporters filled the front rows, scribbling every word. Headlines blared across the country the next morning. Ruth Snyder takes the stand, femme fatale or fallen angel. The public was divided. Some saw her as a monster, others as a woman caught in the trap of her own desires. But one thing was certain. No one could stop talking about her. Each day, the courtroom became more of a theater than a place of justice. People lined up outside just to glimpse her as she entered. They wanted to see the face of evil, or perhaps the face of someone daring enough to defy every expectation of what a wife and mother should be. Ruth had become a cultural fascination, a living headline, and deep down, she seemed to relish it. But as the trial dragged on, the cracks began to show. Witnesses contradicted her story. The evidence, physical and emotional, piled up against her. The jury didn't see a grieving widow anymore. They saw a woman capable of anything, and when the verdict came, the courtroom went silent. Guilty. The word echoed in her ears, soft at first, then thunderous. Ruth didn't cry. She didn't faint. She simply straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and nodded slightly, as though acknowledging a critic's review. Judd broke down completely, his sobs echoing through the chamber. The judge's gavel struck the desk, but the noise didn't matter. The decision was final. Both were sentenced to die in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. Some cheered for justice, others murmured in shock. The trial had gripped America like a fever, and now the fever had broken. But for Ruth, the performance wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. At Sing Sing, the days turned gray and identical. The glamour vanished. The woman who once wore silk now dressed in coarse prison fabric, her hair pulled back, her makeup forbidden. The cell was small, the air stale, the sound of footsteps echoing like ghosts through the halls. She spent her days writing letters, some to her daughter, others to her lawyers, and a few, oddly enough, to reporters. She seemed determined to shape her story even from behind bars. Judd occupied a cell not far from hers. He prayed constantly, sought redemption, and wrote confessions that read more like apologies to the world. Ruth, however, remained composed. She rarely showed remorse. When she spoke to the guards, she was polite, even charming, as though she still believed she might talk her way out of her fate. But time has a way of stripping even the strongest masks. As the execution date approached, Ruth began to unravel in small, quiet ways. The confident tone of her letters softened. The sleepless nights grew longer. She refused visitors some days, claiming headaches. Though those who passed her cell said she just sat there, staring at the wall, her lips moving silently as if rehearsing her final words. Outside the prison, the frenzy hadn't faded. The press couldn't get enough. Newspapers printed every rumor, every scrap of new information. Public curiosity turned morbid. They wanted to know how she spent her last meals, what she said to the chaplain, whether she showed fear. There was something in the air, a hunger to witness the downfall of the woman who had once defied every social expectation. The night before her execution, the air in Sing Sing was thick and unmoving. Ruth slept little, pacing her cell, whispering prayers that sounded more like questions. Judd, in his own cell, broke down completely. He begged God for forgiveness, weeping until the guards led him away. Ruth's silence, by contrast, unnerved everyone. It wasn't calm. It was emptiness, the final resignation of a woman who had run out of masks to wear. January 12, 1928. The day dawned cold and colorless. Ruth was escorted down the narrow corridor they called the last mile. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to steady them. The matron walked beside her, murmuring words of comfort, but Ruth's eyes were distant, fixed on the door ahead. She wore a plain gray dress, the last outfit she would ever own. The electric chair awaited, gleaming under the harsh light. Reporters weren't allowed inside, but one had found a way to make history. In his leg, hidden beneath his pant cuff, a small camera had been strapped, ready to capture the moment the current hit. It would become the most infamous photograph of the era. A ghostly flash that would immortalize her death forever. At 11:10 a.m., Ruth was seated, the straps tightened, the hood placed over her head. Her final words were faint, barely audible. "Goodbye." Then the switch was thrown. The hum of electricity filled the chamber, sharp and brief. And just like that, Ruth Brown Snyder, the suburban housewife who killed for love, was gone. The photograph taken in that split second would appear on front pages the next morning, shocking the world. It showed the exact moment her body convulsed, frozen forever, the price of infamy captured in a flash. Judd followed minutes later, his execution quieter, his death less photographed, less sensational. History would remember her, not him. In the end, Ruth got what she wanted, to be remembered. But not as she'd hoped. Her name became synonymous with deception, vanity, and the dark power of seduction. She was no longer just a woman or a murderer. She was an icon of the dangerous allure of desire. And outside the prison walls, life went on. The crowds dispersed. The headlines faded. But that photograph, that haunting image, ensured that Ruth Brown Snyder's fall from grace would never truly be forgotten. The photograph was grainy, black and white, but it froze a moment that would haunt American history forever. A split second in time, a flashbulb's glare, and the face of Ruth Brown Snyder contorted in her final breath. That image became infamous, the first execution ever captured on film. It was printed on front pages from coast to coast, transforming a quiet, middle-class woman into a symbol of both fascination and horror. In that single, shocking image, the world saw more than just a criminal being punished. They saw a woman, a wife, a mother, who had crossed a line that few dared to approach. The electric chair at Sing Sing prison didn't just end Ruth's life. It electrified the imagination of an entire nation. People debated, moralized, and sensationalized her story, turning her death into spectacle. Reporters called it the crime of the century. But underneath the headlines, something more complex lingered. Ruth was not just another murderer. She represented the collision of love, lust, greed, and media obsession in a rapidly modernizing America. The 1920s were an age of liberation and chaos. Women had just gained the right to vote. Flappers were dancing in jazz clubs, and the country was learning to question old traditions. Against that backdrop, Ruth's story struck a chord. She wasn't the obedient housewife her husband expected, nor the silent woman society preferred. She was defiant and dangerous. But where did rebellion end and evil begin? That's what fascinated people most. Was Ruth a victim of her own passions, or a cold-blooded manipulator who used love as a trap? The public couldn't decide. Some saw her as a tragic figure who lost herself in the search for affection. Others saw her as a monster wrapped in silk stockings. Newspapers painted her every which way, a glamorous seductress one day, a deranged killer the next. And Ruth, even in death, became part of a larger story, America's obsession with the dark side of desire. After her execution, the photograph taken by journalist Tom Howard spread like wildfire. He had snuck a camera into the execution chamber, strapped to his ankle, capturing the forbidden image that would change journalism forever. It wasn't just Ruth who became infamous that day. It was the moment when media and morality collided. The photo blurred the line between truth and exploitation. Some argued it was a necessary look at the consequences of crime. Others said it turned human tragedy into cheap entertainment. Either way, Ruth's death became a spectacle, feeding the very curiosity she once sparked in life. It's almost poetic. The woman who craved attention, who wanted to feel alive and desired, became immortalized by the flash of a hidden camera. In her final moment, she achieved the twisted fame she could never find in life. But for all the noise, what about the quieter truths? Her daughter, Lorraine, just 9 years old when her mother was executed, was left behind to bear the weight of her parents' sins. She grew up in the shadow of infamy, her childhood forever tainted by her mother's name. No matter where she went, Ruth's story followed her, whispered like a ghost in the background. And what of Judd Gray, the lover who shared her fate? His end came the same night in the same chair. The man who had once whispered sweet nothings to Ruth in hotel rooms now faced the same cold justice. Their love, passionate, illicit, and doomed, ended not in escape or freedom, but in 2 lifeless bodies and 1,000 newspaper clippings. Decades later, Ruth's story still lingers in American memory. It's been retold in books, movies, and documentaries, each one trying to unravel the enigma of who she really was. Some portray her as a desperate woman trapped in a loveless marriage. Others see her as a femme fatale who weaponized her charm to destroy everything around her. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Maybe Ruth was both the victim and the villain, a woman driven by longing, twisted by circumstance, and blinded by the dangerous illusion of control. There's something timeless about that story, because deep down it's not just about murder, it's about human weakness. About how love, when mixed with envy and deceit, can turn even the most ordinary person into something unrecognizable. If you close your eyes and imagine her, standing in her parlor, hair perfectly curled, eyes cold and determined, you might almost feel sympathy. She wasn't born a killer, she became one. Slowly, deliberately, under the weight of her own choices. It's a chilling thought, how thin the line is between wanting something and destroying everything to have it. That's why Ruth's story refuses to fade, because it forces us to look inward, to question what we might be capable of, given the right temptation. Her crime wasn't just an act of violence, it was a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest desires. Years later, the house where the murder took place was eventually sold. The furniture replaced, the floors refinished. But locals whispered that the air inside always felt heavy, as if something unseen lingered there. The echo of a struggle, the ghost of a desperate woman who made one final, terrible choice. The newspapers moved on, the reporters chased new scandals, but the legend of Ruth Brown Snyder endured. She became a cautionary tale whispered through generations, about the price of deceit, the danger of passion unchecked, and the unrelenting gaze of a world eager to watch others fall. And in that way, Ruth achieved the immortality she seemed to crave. She became part of history, part of the American mythology of crime and punishment. A woman who defied the rules and paid the ultimate price. The last thing she said before the current surged through her body was almost too faint to hear. Some witnesses claimed she muttered, "Goodbye, darling." Others said she only gasped. But whatever her final words, they were drowned out by the hum of electricity and the click of a hidden camera, sealing her fate in both death and legend. So when we look back on the story of Ruth Brown Snyder, we don't just see a murderess, we see a reflection of the human condition, the fragility of morality, the hunger for attention, the lengths people will go to feel alive, loved, or free. Her story isn't just about crime. It's about the haunting truth that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who smile the brightest. And that's the legacy of Ruth Brown Snyder, the femme fatale who killed for love and became immortalized by the flash of a camera. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more cinematic tales from the dark corners of history, where passion and tragedy dance in the same shadow.